Good morning, everyone. We are about to start our webinar very shortly, so I'll just give it another 30 seconds or so to allow as many delegates as possible to join our event this morning. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to this Morgan Hunt webinar, Exploring Governance and the Expectations of the Role Across Different Organisations. We'll cover a governor's role, explore stakeholder engagement strategies, best practice in terms of strengthening governance, and we'll run through a quick case study to share that best practice in real life example. My name is Claire Canary, and I'm a board director at Morgan Hunt. And for those of you who do not know us, Morgan Hunt is a UK-based recruitment business established over 30 years ago. We have 150 recruiters in Glasgow, Manchester, Birmingham, and London. And our award-winning recruitment teams place specialist talent within organisations across the UK in the charity, education, finance, government, property, social care, private and technology sectors. And I am delighted to be joined this morning by two real experts in this field and the founding directors of Pro Excellence Partnership Limited. Pro Excellence Partnership works with organisations to provide leadership and management mentoring training, improve quality, support strategic development, governance advisory support, as well as many other consulting services. So firstly, welcome to Kate Liu, who is a director and founder and has over 20 years expertise in leadership, education, and quality within training and the skills sector. She currently sits on 4 boards, including a chair role, where she specialises in mentoring CEOs and senior leaders in strategic development, quality improvement, and governance training. And we're also joined this morning by Dr. Gareth Thomas, who is also a founder and director of Pro Excellence Partnership. He has significant experience in successful public sector implementation, performance improvement, and stakeholder management. Gareth is currently a governance board member for several independent training providers and a university advisory board. So before we kick off our main session this morning, just a quick note on our structure. Our discussion will take about 45 to 50 minutes. We'll aim to finish at 10:30 this morning. If you have any questions for our panel, please post those in the YouTube chat and we will see them and we'll endeavour to answer as many of those as possible. But I'm going to pass you over to Kate now and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for that kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Having looked at the delegate list today, we've got a brilliant mix of people with us on this session. Some of you are seasoned in governance, and others are just stepping into this role. So we've got real representation of experience, but also across sectors. We've got some education, local authorities, housing, training providers, and I know that there's some more in there as well. So welcome to this session. And it's also having that great mix is what's going to make today's session so valuable. Because while governance might look a little different in each of your settings, at its heart, it's all about the same thing, which is strategic oversight, accountability, but also making sure that our organisations are well led, well managed, and delivering real impact. It's also about asking the right questions, providing that constructive challenge, safeguarding the interests of your learners, your staff, your communities, your customers. And yes, it's about being a strong, supportive voice around that table. So let's be really clear for today's session that good governance isn't just about a tick box exercise. It is about adding real value. And whether that's helping shape a long-term vision, monitoring outcomes, or drawing on your own personal or lived experiences to guide decision making, that's what's going to be really key for good governance. So today, what we want to do is explore what that looks like in practice across sectors, across different provider types, and also at different stages of that journey. I'm really pleased to say that we're joined today by Dan Bill, who is also one of our amazing associates that's working with the Pro Excellence Partnership, and he's also going to be part of the conversation with us today. So hopefully it's going to be a really informative session that we're going to work through. And we're going to start at the foundation. So going right back to the basics, which is what is governance really? How is it understood? How is it used? And looking at that across different organisations. So Claire, I'm going to hand back to you if that's okay for you to kick off with your questions.
Thank you, Kate. That's great. So as Kate says, looking at those foundations and understanding the purpose of governance and how it's interpreted in practice. So Gareth, I'd like to come to you, please. And from your perspective, what is the core purpose or role of governors, and how do these roles differ between different types of organisations in different sectors? So, for example, charity, not-for-profit, further education colleges, independent training providers, housing associations, and local authorities.
Thanks, Claire. Morning, everybody. I think the key thing for me is there's some fundamentals which are common across all types of organisations, which is the role of providing support as well as challenge. Holding management to account is obviously a key part of it and what a lot of people understand by the term governance. However, providing the support is equally as important. But the key thing for me is it does vary depending on your legal structure, the type of organisation you are there for, and also the sector you work in. So I'll come into that in a little bit more detail, Claire. So if you're a limited company, you have company directors. They are legally accountable for your business. Those individuals may form part of your governance. Now, in some sectors that might be sufficient, but in others, a condition of funding, for example, if you let's pick a company where you may have a limited company delivering apprenticeships. One of the conditions from the Department for Education is that you have to have governance arrangements with the right expertise. Now, your company directors may own and run the business legally, but they may not have that expertise. So you'll have to bring it in additionally. Those individuals wouldn't be legally accountable for running that business. The directors still are. However, in other organisations, such as a further education college, the board of governors are actually the legal accountable body for running that organisation. So there's no one simple solution. If you're a charity, you've got a board of trustees. The trustees are legally accountable for running the organisation. But as well as the legal structure of the business, it's your contracts you hold, the funders that you work with. What are the conditions of funding or conditions of trade that you've got with other organisations that may have governance requirements in there? So what I would say is, it sounds like a cop-out. It's not. But the key thing is for your own sector, your own organisation, and depending on where your funding comes from, if it comes from combined authorities, local authorities, central government, charitable donations, however you are structured and the contracts you hold, you need to go and do the research into those in some detail to make sure you're meeting conditions that are expected of you. To pick another sector, just to bring it slightly further to light, which would be the sports sector. If you're a sports organisation, a sports governing body, Sport England have a code of governance which has various tiers. So not only does it depend on the sector you're in and who your funders are, but it depends on the size and type of organisation you are. So in sport, if your income is up to about £250,000 a year and you're a regional or local organisation, the chances are you'll only have to comply with tier 3 code of governance. Whereas if you are a national sports governing body, you may have to comply with tier 1, which has got more stringent requirements. So it's not just the sector and the type of organisation, but also the size and what you do. So it's quite complex. There's no simple answer, but the advice would be to go and do a little bit of digging into your organisation and requirements on you.
Yeah, so really understanding those structures of your own organisation is really important. And Gareth, you touched on this when you gave that sport example. But what are the key statutory or regulatory requirements of governance, say, by other sectors? Are there any others that stand out to you in terms of that statutory and regulatory piece?
It's interesting. So if you think about the further education sector and colleges, the board of governors, the corporation, as it's been known for a long time in our sector, the members of that corporation are legally accountable for the financials of the college, for the safeguarding elements of the college, and the provisions put in place for the students. Those roles again vary depending on the sector you're in, but generally it'll be around the quality of what you provide, the financial safeguarding of the organisation, the safeguarding of young and vulnerable people that different organisations deal with. And actually, some of the large national charities may not specialise in that, but they will come into contact with young and vulnerable people. So there's still a legal accountability there. But then when you come back to the example of limited companies, the directors will carry some of those responsibilities legally, but the governors are there to ensure a quality service is delivered.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Gareth. And I'd like to kind of come on to looking at how governance can offer so much more than, add so much more value, really. So not just scrutiny at meetings, but how they can add that genuine value. So, Kate, in your opinion, how do you get that right, the right governors for your organization in terms of you're looking for those that can add more than just the scrutiny, really add the value?
Absolutely. For me, getting the right governors really does start with being clear on what your organisation actually needs. First, it's important to look at the skills, experience, perspectives you already have on the board, and then identify where your gaps are. So that might be in areas like finance, safeguarding, digital strategy, quality assurance, or community engagement. It's not just about ticking a skills checklist. It's about finding the people who bring strategic thinking, constructive challenge, and genuine commitment to your mission. But it's identifying the gaps that you do have within that organisation. I mean, we found that a mix of professional backgrounds and lived experiences really strengthens the board. It helps bring in different viewpoints. It makes for richer, more balanced decision making. Sometimes that means looking beyond your usual networks, reaching out through sector bodies, community groups, or targeted recruitment campaigns to attract the right people who might not typically put themselves forward, but have so much to offer in those sectors. It's also about being clear during the recruitment about what's expected of your governors, not just attending the meetings, but being actively engaged, prepared to support and challenge, bringing their expertise to bear between the meetings too. It's not just about having those board meetings that you're having 3 times a year. Being a really valuable governor means about having more interaction through as we move through. When you take a strategic, inclusive approach to board recruitment, you're much more likely to build a team that can truly add value and support the organisation to grow and improve. I'm going to bring Gareth in here because I think we can probably bring that a bit more to life in terms of some examples.
Thanks, Kate. I think when Kate talks about the type of organisation and what you do between meetings, board meetings, governance meetings, they may not be called boards, by the way. There may be committees, there may be working groups. They can all be part of your governance structure. One of the key things for me is understanding what type of organisation you are and who your board members are likely to be. So when do your meetings take place, as an example? Just real practical things. When you're advertising for that, for those governors to come on board, have you been really clear about what those expectations are? Because some will be typically volunteers who may have day jobs. Some may be people who work for big corporates who will give them time off in the daytime to undertake governance roles. If you work in a local authority, it's quite normal for them to give you time off to work in a governance role if you're a school governor or a college governor, for example, or on the board of a housing association. Whereas if you run an SME or a micro business, the chances are you won't be able to take as much time off flexibly in the day. Also, if you are a charity, for example, dealing with certain types of disability, you may have board members who are enthusiastic because of family circumstances, but may not be able to commit. So understanding how and when you're going to hold meetings, do work between meetings, and what that expectation is critical, because what you don't want to do is go out, put the effort into recruiting someone who then says, I can't commit to those times, I can't commit to those times. So that little bit of clarity can help you go a long way. I
Right.
think Dan will bring in at this point, Claire, if that's all right.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just mention a few bits if I may. Morning, everyone. One of the key roles I've been fortunate to have in the past was one of His Majesty's inspectors with Ofsted. And it meant I've met a large array of different governors across ITPs, colleges, local authorities as well. But what stands out as the most successful ones? In other words, how can you be fantastic as being a governance oversight? And I first of all say it's really important to know it's a role to be really proud of. The impact that I see some of the governors I work with is remarkable. I find too many of them don't come off the hamster wheel and actually genuinely sit down and say, what impact have we had? And it's something certainly as Ofsted point of view I would ask a lot, but actually it's an important question, even if you're not an education provider. What's really important for governors, those that I see most effective, is they recognise the difference between governing an organisation and leading an organisation. It's very easy to get into the weeds sometimes and get into all the detail, but actually a governance role is that balcony perspective to really look at the KPIs, if there's risk registers, any quality improvement plans that may exist, and holding leaders to account on those. Having been a senior leader myself in the past, I've experienced governors perhaps trying to get into too much detail. But the most successful ones was the transparency, that culture of transparency. So I'm giving reports, I'm giving information to governors so that they can then hold me to account as effectively as possible. I have been, sadly, into some organisations where governors are kept out of the loop a little bit too much. And when it comes to knowing how successful the organisation is, they're just not accurate. They just don't know. So this culture of transparency is really important. And it just enables that success to come through. But a classic question for governors is, what areas do you focus on that will have the greatest impact? What examples have you got of where you have challenged, and how did that enhance the success of the organisation that you govern? And being able to answer those questions are really key. I'm also a trustee of a local swimming club, and while that's not an education provider, the goals are still the same. Is the business successful? Are we giving the best service to the customers, i.e. the swimmers in this case? Are we communicating effectively? But are we getting feedback from our stakeholders so that we can action that and put that in place? That becomes really, really prevalent. So for me, it is a culture of transparency. As governors, you are getting the correct information in a timely manner to then challenge and support effectively. Challenge and support are the key words. Support, great. Hug, support, all those things, but you've got to have the challenge there as the ambassador and the champion for excellence.
Right, thank you, Dan. And Kate, could I just come back to you just on that point? Have you got any examples in terms of maximising that impact of governors within, say, a safeguarding specific environment?
Absolutely. So my role on boards is very much around education and training and skills. So for us, safeguarding is critical within that sector. And some of the best safeguarding governance that I've seen is when you've got someone who's got that real lived-in experience. So they've got the hands-on strategic experience of leading safeguarding. So they are providing the real challenge around how is safeguarding embedded into the curriculum, how is it reviewed within the learning plans. But also when we talk about actually the support element is they were able to deliver CPD for the staff. They're able to act as a mentor for people internally who have those safeguarding roles, which is a critical role. So it's really about building an understanding around what emerging safeguarding concerns are and supporting the team. But as Dan said, it is that strategic, it's that challenge that they're providing all the way through. But we see that critical across all of them. What I do also see is when you see it, it's not as impactful, and that's where someone who is turning up and receiving a board report, and they're not having the value and the impact of sharing their experience across sectors, across what they've learned or what they're implementing in their day jobs, and how they're bringing that into the areas. But when it's done really well, safeguarding is a prime example for me.
Great. I mean, this just kind of comes to me, but you're all on boards, and do you see examples of good chairs who kind of will tease that out in individuals? So I don't know who, Gareth, you're nodding there. What should a good chair be doing to kind of encourage maybe people who are a little reticent and maybe new to the role, but actually have a lot to, they know they have a lot to add, but they just don't feel like they can talk up at that point. How do you facilitate that?
I think, Claire, for me, one of the things around good chairing is obviously being organised, some of the basics of chairing meetings, but it's not just chairing the meetings, it's chairing the governance between meetings, making sure that the support as well as the challenge between meetings is taking place, having clear record keeping of what's expected, when it's going to happen. By the usual things around action logs are fine, but it actually needs a bit of chasing up, and the chair will do that, but quite often they'll need some administrational support, some management support to do that. One of the key things for the role of the chair is to actually, well, two key things. One is make sure the information they're receiving is accurate. All too often we see it where data reports, information going to boards. When you really get under the skin of it, if you're an expert, you get under the skin of it, you find that actually what they've been told isn't quite the truth. And it might be that officers in an organisation inflate numbers, they lose bits of information, they won't necessarily tell something that's not true, but they won't tell you the whole picture. So having the skill set within your team and as a chair, identifying the skills you need and working with your management support to make sure you can really get under the skin of that is, for me, a key part of that. The other one is to make sure that the chair has a proactive role in partly being part of the face of the organisation as well with external stakeholders, because generally your chairs are well respected individuals who have been successful in a walk of life, and it doesn't actually have to be restricted to your chairs. The members of your governance board can add a lot more through their external contacts, what they can do for your business, what can they take from their daily life and their working life that they've been successful in previously, and bring to the business. So that's key, but the organisation, making sure that that information is accurate and what happens between the meetings, the role of the chair is key in driving that. If you have a lazy chair who turns up, chairs the meeting, walks away and expects the business to get on with it, the chances are the business won't get on with it in the same way.
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. I know we've kind of gone off topic a little, but it's just interesting to kind of think about that in the context of the governor's role. So to be effective, governors need the right tools, and they certainly need ongoing development, and that support, maybe training. So, Gareth, if I could come back to you, what tools do you believe governors need to be effective in their role?
So again, it depends on your sector. It depends on the nature of the organisation, the conditions of funding. But the key thing is what information do they need? So whether it's the key things that typically they'll be looking at will be financial stability and solvency of organisations. They'll be looking at things such as the safeguarding, the quality of the service provided. They'll be looking at the stakeholder and customer feedback and the service improvement, regardless of your type of organisation. But when it comes to the tools, how is that information presented? How is it tracked over time? How do we see trends and improvements? But again, how do they know that that is accurate data? I've personally worked with an organisation, a big public sector organisation, who we went in to do a review of part of their offer, not the whole offer, and starting to dig at that, uncovered the fact that virtually everything going to the board in that organisation wasn't an accurate reflection of what was happening in the organisation. And actually, it's a failing of governance, not a failing of that team. It can be argued it's a failing of that team, but if the governors had really scrutinised, got under the skin and really understood the data they were looking at. So one of it's getting the right information. Part of it, and probably bring Dan in a second on this, is giving them the information, giving them the tools is one thing, but if they don't know how to use it well and don't know what they're looking at, we get a lot of enthusiastic trustees, governors, board members in all sorts of walks of life, but they have a passion for the subject, but they don't have the expertise to understand what they're looking at and the level of detail required. I think that's where CPD comes in at all phases, from induction through your ongoing role. Dan, you might have a view on that. Someone who's delivered governance training.
Thanks, Gareth. So CPD is really essentially it's quite clear the most successful organizations have invested in their governors. While they bring a lot of skill and knowledge and experience already to the role, we want all governors to feel really comfortable and confident in the role as well, so they can carry out the role as successfully as possible. Some of the CPD we have done in the past as examples, which I think work really well, is when we can bring the board together, the committee together as a group in person where that's an opportunity, but also in collaboration with senior teams and leadership teams to really look at what's the strategic direction of the organization? What is our why? Why do we exist? What is our purpose? Lots of training just coming back to that point. It's very easy to be on the hamster wheel and going through the activities, but just come off the roller coaster, press pause, and actually really consider who are we, where are we going? Because governors do have that key role about supporting strategic direction. And is it the right move? Is it the right way to go? So that can work really well. We've done lots of training around Ofsted, of course, so understanding the Ofsted framework, that's really important. And Ofsted will hold education-based organisations to account. We can share lots of training on the types of questions you would be asked, how to craft a really strong narrative to each of those questions so that you feel very comfortable that if you see an inspector opposite you, you've got your storytelling really nailed down. Part of it comes back to your examples of where you've challenged and what the impact of that has been, which I mentioned earlier. Lots of training around safeguarding, how the single central record works, for example, if you have one of those. We've done lots of training around questioning, how to hold people to account and how to try and elicit that information, but also report reading, creating effective reports for governors. I've seen some that are about 100 pages. Well, no one's going to read it. Governors are too busy. But actually how to have concise documents which enable you to be very clear in advance of your meeting what I need to talk about and challenge, because you just don't have time. So how can we get people focusing on the areas that will have the greatest impact? Essentially with CPD, we can bespoke it towards the needs of the organisation. So what do you need? Where are you in your journey? How confident do you feel? Have you got new governors, experienced governors? And we can tailor that training so that you feel highly effective and, as I said, comfortable and confident in your role.
Right. Thank you, Dan. Gareth, did you want to add something on that in terms of that tailoring of CPD?
It's actually coming back a step before, Claire, to the tools as well. One of the things, just to give people a couple of practical examples that are very, I think, impactful, is keeping your governance fresh is an important approach rather than a tool. Governors get stale, they get complacent. They don't mean to, but if they've been in role for a long time, some, depending on the nature of the organisation, government policy changes, the types of organisation you're working with, where their funding comes from changes. So making sure the people you've got in your governance are up to date with that is key and kept fresh. The other thing, though, for me is how the business supports the governors in terms of tools. So if I give you an example of one organisation that I do some work with, they have learner governors on their board. They don't attend the whole meeting. They're not there for the financial aspects. But when we talk about quality of education, those people are involved. And those people need some help. So if they're a learner governor, we set them up a learner governor email account that actually some of the support staff in the business will run for them. Some of those, they'll go out with surveys, they'll collate it, and they'll provide it to the learner governors, because it would be too much to expect of them on a part-time role to be able to undertake all of that work. The same with some of the, you might have some of your customers, if you've got commercial customers, business customers, clients, you may have representatives of those on the board as governors. And again, what support do they need to be effective to gather information from the community they represent on your board? So when we talk about tools, some of them are quite straightforward, quite easy to do, but people don't put them in place, and then the governors feel that they're not having the impact because they're not getting the information from their community to bring forward. So how you support them doing that is quite important.
Great, thank you, Gareth. And Kate, in your experience, have you seen successful models of, say, peer support or shared learning between governors across organisations?
Absolutely. It doesn't happen as frequently as I would like to see, but peer support and shared learning are essential to strengthening governance, and it's starting to improve, I would say. I think one of the most effective approaches I've seen working as governor is when people work across different sectors or different providers. So, for example, I have one where the governance team, they work between a college and they also oversee work within an ITP. And there's a lot of shared training, shared experiences. And what you get to see is governors are invited to observe each other's board meetings. They might do some joint training, as I said. But that cross-sector involvement's helped broaden perspectives. It also encourages a bit more fresh thinking. So you see how similar challenges, like Ofsted readiness, for example, from a college perspective and an ITP, curriculum design, employer engagement, you can see how they're tackled in different settings. They're then able to bring those insights back to their own boards, and that often leads to more tangible improvements. I do find that when governance operates across different sectors, they help build a more connected and consistent approach to governance. It encourages collaboration better, and it reduces the isolation that sometimes can happen within decision making. So it just gives you that broader scope. So yeah, I do think peer engagement shouldn't be seen as optional. It should be practical, effective way to build confidence, challenge assumptions, and raise standards. And we do see it in some settings, but I definitely think, especially if you are a governor and you're working across different sectors, you'll see the benefits of that peer learning and that peer support. And if you haven't had that opportunity, it's definitely something that to build your confidence and to step into another area or another sector. And I would say that's one of the areas that we've worked with in coaching and mentoring governors to how to work in a charity sector or to step into a training provider rather than a college, because they're all very different nuances, ultimately bringing hopefully the same goal and direction.
And just out of interest, are there you've mentioned there's some sectors that do it quite well. So just for the benefit of our delegates, what sectors have you seen that kind of good practice within, in your experience, that sharing and that peer support?
So for me, it's the education. That's where I would say I've seen it done really well. If we think about the difference, so in terms of the education sector, if you're looking from a further education college and you're looking at an independent training provider, we're delivering the same with the same business, the same structure. We're all into education. We will have learners at the centre of everything that we're working towards. It's all around curriculums, and we have the same regulatory bodies. But they're still two different organisations, but with the same challenges. So that's where I've seen it work really well. And you'll see more and more governors that are working across those different areas. So, for example, I've been a college governor, but I've also now worked on ITPs, and I know Dan and Gareth are very similar. With all of our backgrounds is probably very similar, and you can see how there is definitely some shared learning and some real strengths to collaborate in that aspect.
Great, thank you, Kate. So I think now I'd like to hand over to Gareth. You've just mentioned also housing associations are pretty good at collaboration and sharing expertise in your experience.
Yeah, and it depends on regulation as well. So you've got an ombudsman who's supportive of the sector largely, but because housing associations quite often aren't on the same patch, they will collaborate where they're not competing for the same customers. And actually, with a lot of educational institutions, they think they're competitors, but when you get into the nuances of what their offer is, they may appear at the surface very similar, but actually they are going to be dealing with different customer groups. So actually, the housing associations we've found can be quite helpful and receptive both ways, both with education organisations, because if you think about colleges, for example, one thing housing associations want to do is help their tenants progress because they've got a high propensity and ability to pay their rent. So how do you help them do that? It's about helping them get into work. So it might be employment type organisations. It might be further education colleges or training providers who can help them with apprenticeships or pre-employment training. Equally, it may be drug and rehabilitation charities because they can help those. So looking outside your own sector, so where the housing associations can work collaboratively, where they're not on the same doorstep, but they're working at arm's length from each other, on your own doorstep, working across the complementary services that have similar client bases, similar objectives at heart, can be a really interesting thing to explore further. So when you look at your customer base, your client base, what are the trends you see in that? What are the demographic information that might be useful in identifying potential targets? And don't be afraid to headhunt when you're looking for your board members. Go looking for specifics, don't be general. And I'll say it tongue in cheek, Claire, but when you put an advert out locally that says we want someone with a finance expertise, you're going to get a local accountant, but you may not get a local accountant who knows anything about your sector and how the accountant works there and the finances work there. So make sure you get the right fit for the areas of expertise you want. Yes,
that makes complete sense. Thanks, Gareth. I'd like to pass over to you all now, because I think Kate, Dan and Gareth, you'd like to run through a quick case study around a further education college and ITP sharing practice. So over to you.
Thank you. I think that's over to myself.
Over to you, Dan. Great.
Thank you, Claire. The first example I wanted to share is from a college. I know many of you are from colleges on the call. And it's an example where things didn't quite go how they wanted and what unraveled. And this was during an inspection that I happened to be leading once upon a time. So we recognised this college had a significant number of high needs learners. In other words, learners that we would regard as the most vulnerable and need the most support. We found that they weren't making the progress that they should in comparison to their starting points. When we started to dig a little bit deeper, leaders just weren't aware of who those learners were. They didn't really know how many they had in the organisation. So then I got a bit curious and started looking around a bit more. I then found that high needs learners never appeared in any senior leadership meetings. And then I thought, well, let's turn another stone over and find out if governors know about it. And in the governors meeting, sure enough, they weren't aware what high needs meant. It was never reported in any board minutes or meetings, which meant the most senior people in the organisation, the governors and leaders, weren't looking after the most vulnerable learners. They weren't being champions for those learners. And ultimately, where does the accountability sit? Well, it was leaders and governors. So once I was able to report that, they made some quite swift changes, which was good, including putting in a link governor for high needs and vulnerable learners, which was good practice. But it was despite them trying to attribute some of the fault towards middle managers, ultimately in this circumstance, it was leaders and governors. If there isn't that clear reporting line where someone is championed for those learners in those reports, then it becomes a real problem, and that impacted their grade negatively on that occasion. And they learned some valuable lessons, I think. The other example I wanted to give from really training providers and some local authorities, it's around skills boot camps. We've seen a huge number of those increasing recently. Where I've seen them done really well from a governance perspective is that the governors are absolute champions for the why of the organisation. Why are we getting into skills boot camps, and what's the potential impact, possibly around social mobility or possible future training to upskill staff, whatever that might be. But these governors were relentless in recognising in this circumstance who the vulnerable adults were, how we can drive social mobility. And no, we don't want to get into that market because that doesn't satisfy who we are and what our purpose is. So they were real champions of purpose, the governors in this training provider, but they represented the vulnerable learners to make sure that they got all the support, guidance and intervention so that they could be successful and move into future successful careers in that circumstance. So there's an example where governors didn't have the oversight in the college of those key learners, and in the training provider very much champions for them and can talk at length about it. And I know my colleague, I'm sure, will have other examples.
Yeah, Gareth, I just wondered, you've mentioned you've got that a sixth form experience, or you've got an example, because we know we've got a number of delegates on from that kind of background. So would you like to talk through a case study in that sector?
Schools generally, actually, Claire, is an area that the Careers and Enterprise Company have been supporting nationally to help them implement a framework around careers education, careers advice and guidance for young people based on a framework called the Gatsby framework. And what we've found there is where you've got a sponsor governor with an area with a genuine interest in that, then we've had much greater success nationally for the schools really embedding good careers programs for young people. Where it's left to a teacher without that governance support, it's much harder because, coming back to what we said earlier, the governors are legally accountable. When they take on that accountability proactively, then they tend to drive much greater outcomes for learners in the schools, for the pupils, whatever that area is. So that's an example where we've seen it. A lot of the schools will be working with enterprise advisors who are volunteers. They're not part of the governance formally. So how they are allowed to work with governors as well as with the school leaders, the managers, the vice principals, whoever it may be, has been absolutely key in that. And we see that now across other types of organisation where we've got dedicated leads on boards that have a real impact, whether it be safeguarding, whether it be equality and diversity, whether it's the finance. So making sure that you've got those leads clearly identified, up to speed, and that you've got the right CPD in place for those governors, because rules change, requirements change on organisations on an ongoing basis. And if the governors are part-time volunteers, they may be remunerated, they may not be, depending on the type of organisation. The chances are they won't be quite as finger on the pulse as the people working in that organisation day in, day out. So it's how you can make sure you support your governors doing that. And the careers advice is an area where it's worked best. We've had that board buy-in, and it's things like having a strategy for that area of work owned by the board, so that if your teacher who's leading that in a school does choose to move, it happens, school teachers move around, principals move around, vice principals move around, then actually the work doesn't drop. The boards still have that oversight, they still have that challenge around it. So that drives a huge impact compared to not having that governance buy.
Great, thank you, Gareth. Anyone else got anything else to share around that kind of case study, practical example? No, that's fine. What I'd like to do then is just turn to some other questions that we've got, but just I think we've touched on some of this, but maybe not all. So it'd be quite good to kind of cover if that's okay. So first one is around that best practice to ensure there's real clarity between, I suppose, the board and the governor's oversight role, and then the management's operational role. So what, in your opinion, should be the governor's involvement, if any, in shaping long-term strategy versus focusing on short-term operational issues? So, I suppose it's when you sometimes get a bit of blurring of lines. Gareth, you're nodding, so maybe I'll go to you. Oh, Dan, you've got your hand up, so I'll go to you first.
Sorry, thank you. I know we can all talk to this one. I think what's really critical for the board is to have those key strategic documents that they never lose sight of. So, for example, if it's a quality improvement plan, if it's the KPIs, the strategic objectives, that's never lost sight. That's been sat down, planned, created. It's not something you do once and then look at again a year later. It becomes your guiding principles for that period of time. So in your board meetings, committees, there's always a review of how successfully are we working to those. In addition, however, in answer to the short term, there still needs to be reporting on the now. Because it's like you stick your finger in one hole to stop the water and it comes out of somewhere else. So you still need to be monitoring the today through those reportings that you have, but never losing sight of the strategic oversight. And that's where governors really come in. Because many leaders, middle managers, they can be on that hamster wheel of activity. And actually, as governors, you can bring people back to asking two questions, which is, if you're doing that, who is that serving and what's the impact? And asking those type of questions can be really key.
And does it relate back to what our overall strategy is? Because if it doesn't, then really should we be focusing on that?
Absolutely,
that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Gareth, do you have any thoughts on that one? I think you were nodding. Oh, I think you mentioned the legal structure is also important when considering the governance role. So do you want to talk to that?
And that's the key thing for me here is, if you've got governance arrangements where the governors are legally accountable for an organisation, such as trustees of a charity, members of a further education corporation board, then them being involved in setting those strategies is absolutely key for that organisation, because they are legally accountable for it. If it's, say, a limited company where you've got a requirement from your funders to have governance arrangements, but they're not legally accountable, you'll want probably more of a support and challenge role around that strategy, because they don't own the business and they're not accountable for it. others are. So how do you work together in that way? So it's getting the balance right. But I think if you start from the principle of charities, public sector bodies where your governors are legally accountable, in those cases, they need to be involved in that setting the strategy. But it's then over to the management team to deliver on that strategy and to do the doing. It's understanding the time to step back and say, right, hand over to you guys.
Great, thanks, Gareth. Dan?
There's a brief point just around best practice that I've seen that while as governors you get hopefully useful reports about what's happening and what's going on, those that manage to embed themselves a little bit more in the organisation, not managing the organisation, the point I made earlier, but if it is education, popping into some lessons alongside with some managers, or if it is an in-person site, walking around the site, what does it look like, feel like to be here? Just relying on a piece of paper and a report, is it giving you enough to assure yourself as a governor the organisation is successful? So how can you find initiatives to actually embed yourself a little bit more, just to be able to engage with its success on a not a daily basis per se, but as your schedule enables you to be involved, I think is key and good practice.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And Kate, if I could come to you, I mean, this is kind of on the same theme, but slightly different. It's that balance between oversight but fostering a really strong, productive working relationship with senior management. So maybe in your experience, where have you seen that work? And without naming names, maybe the sector, but why did that alignment work? You know, where the governors didn't tread on toes, but had a strong relationship for the benefit of the organisation.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably one of the most important and often most delicate aspects of effective governance. So high-performing boards, they know how to hold the organisation to account while also acting as supportive of, you're saying, strategic partners. I suppose an example I've got is it's quite a large commercial training provider. And having that governance role where they're really focusing on the oversight in terms of that challenge, the perspectives of those elements of it. And it links in with the support. So it is the challenge and the support. It is one of those most delicate areas because we can overstep very clearly as a governor. If we feel that within our own roles, we know how to do the job in a slightly different way and we can step into that management. And I know Dan picked up on that quite a lot earlier about it's not about leading the organisation, like managing the organisation, it's helping lead and go with the strategic direction. But within this commercial organisation, it was more around the chair. So the chair role, stepping into more of an operational management of the organisation rather than the strategic lead, which is where we needed to work through. So it didn't work in the way that we would have wanted it to. It's and I think I'm probably seeing it from that commercial element. It was more of a step in and take charge and own operational day to day rather than let's support, let's guide, let's hold you to account, but also working through. Oh, sorry, just seeing Gareth.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, Kate. So it can go wrong when somebody just does that. I'll step into that role. I'll start managing this, which is
and I think
older. Yeah,
this is when we were talking about having the right people in the right skill sets into the right roles. So we want to have those lived in shared experiences, and we want to have people that have the right knowledge and backgrounds within their sectors. But sometimes it's still having that as an oversight, and as Dan talks about it, about the balcony view. And sometimes I think when it's the balance isn't correct is when we step down and we're stepping into the organisation and we're hands-on trying to manage the organisation rather than pulling ourselves back up from a governance perspective and having the oversight to lead. And it is a delicate element to do. It's very hard sometimes to sit with your hands behind your back to give guidance and give support when sometimes it's easier to roll your sleeves up and feel like you can step in and do it, because most people that are in a governance role have been in those operational roles, and that's where the experience and the oversight and the strategic support comes from. And that's why I say for me it's one of the most key areas for us in terms of oversight, direction and challenge, but it's also a delicate blend.
Yeah, delicate balance. Gareth, you've mentioned that kind of staff, general staff, I suppose, within the organisation, their understanding of the governor's role is pretty key, and that mentoring can be really helpful in this. So, what do you mean by that?
For me, Claire, we see a big difference in that some organisations, the governors are well respected, they're well known within a business. It's not unusual for them to be chatting to members of staff, to be doing that testing between meetings to find out, is what I'm being told really the case? But also to offer their support in that if you've got someone who's the commercial director of a worldwide organisation on your board, which is not unusual, well, how are they supporting your business development team? How are they helping to nurture the skills of those staff between meetings? Because those junior staff may not come to the board meeting, but they may have an opportunity to learn from someone who's really great in at that type of role. So, but you can't do that unless the staff know who the governors are, where their roles start and end, what's expected of them, and how they can interact with them. So I work with one organisation where they don't have expertise in a certain technical area that I do. One of their members of staff will ring me for advice. I won't do the job for her. I won't, but I'll give her the advice about how she could go around solving the problem, how she could go around dealing with something. They see that as a really valuable part of that governor's role. It's not taking over the management. I don't manage that member of staff. They have a line manager. They deal with all of that. It's that expert input when they need it. And I may not hear from her for months. I may hear from her 3 times in a week. But it's having that flexibility, that way of understanding of working is quite clearly defined about where the boundaries are. So for me, the best way to get the best out of your governors is to make sure your staff know who they are, how they can help them, and making sure that the staff, the senior staff especially, but also middle managers, don't feel threatened by your governors. They should be seen as part of your business, not the police.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is still something that we haven't always got quite right in multiple sectors at the moment.
I think you're right. I think sometimes you can even sense that. You can see that the staff don't even want to talk to the governors because they haven't been maybe been given that permission by senior management, because there's almost they're trying, potentially, maybe not intentionally, but there's a little bit of a we'll just keep them away at arm's length. But that sounding board and that mentoring sounds really useful. And just kind of again aligned to this topic that we've been talking about, and that kind of relationship between senior management and governors or a board. Can you share best practices in terms of regular communication between the board and CEO or senior management? What have you seen that really works in terms of opening up that communication and keeping it going? Kate, can I come to you first on that?
So for me, it's about having that scheduled, structured touch points. And when I've seen it done really well is when the chair has those monthly sessions that are booked in to talk around what's the current risks, how's everyone performing, what are the strengths, and it's really having those that they are structured, they're scheduled, everyone knows that they're happening. So as a governor, you feel connected and you feel that you're understanding what's happening within those organisations. Where I've seen it not done so well is when I literally just receive a board pack before I go to a board, and I might see them every 3 months. So really having best practice is the regular check-ins, because it makes me feel invested into that organisation, and I know that I'm going to understand what's happening and be kept up to date with the current workings. It's also the consistent reporting. So absolutely having those reports, but are they concise reports? Gareth and I have been on the similar boards before, and some of the reports, as he said earlier, 100-page documents and things like that. So it's really about having that consistency in reporting. And as governors, it's about asking and helping shape what we want from that reporting. So what's going to give us the oversight in terms of what do we need to be able to see to help challenge effectively and also to support, but also the informal communication challenges. So outside of the formal meetings, it's about creating that space. So it may be I go in and I do learning walks, for example. Go in and meet with some of the teams and have some team meetings. I also work as a coach or a mentor to different people within organisations. So if it fits within my skill set, it's about how do I coach and how do I mentor individual people within the organisation. So the support and challenge, what it also means is when I go to the board and I'm there as a critical friend and I'm there as that support and challenge, I have faith that what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing in being reported to me, I've tested it. And I think for me, that level of communication. And when we talk about the check-ins, it's normally the chair and the CEO that will have a structured, and then the chair normally then has those structured sessions with the rest of the governance board. That's predominantly been my experiences, and I don't know, Gareth and Dan might want to share something slightly different, but my experience has normally been almost like a two-pronged CEO and chair, just to make sure that it's very much aligned in what they need to do, and then the chair with the rest of the governance board.
Dan, do you have an opinion on that, or you've seen it work well, I guess?
I obviously I agree entirely with everything Kate just articulated very well, but I think in addition, what I have seen, well, I think I may have touched on this earlier, is that there are points in the year where governors do actually work closely with the senior leadership team, however many there are, just around, again, purpose and strategy, and really trying to map out who we are, where are we trying to get to, are we well resourced, and what are our deliverables going to be, and how we're going to measure that success over time. I've really enjoyed joining some of those in some of the CPD we've done, which is having both governors and senior leaders together. What they then have allocated in some places I've seen is as a link governor to certain staff within certain functions. So it might be a safeguarding, it might be someone about the skills agenda, meeting skills, it might be something about an apprenticeship champion. But knowing the skills of the people you bring on your board, as Gareth said, they've got a lot of wealth of experience. How can they share that to be a champion of that member of staff who can benefit from their coaching and mentoring outside of the board meetings that take place every quarter, for example? So strategy days, coming together, linking people can be highly effective. I've seen that done very well.
Great, thank you. Well, that's pretty much all we've got time for today. I'd just like to thank all our delegates, everyone who joined us. We know we had individuals from an array of organisations. So I hope that you found this as useful and as interesting as I did. But also a massive thanks to my three guests, to Kate, to Gareth and to Dan. From Pro Excellent Partnership Limited. Really appreciate your time and your expert input to our topic today. Just to everyone who's joined, we've recorded this session and we will be circulating the session to everyone who's signed up within the next 24 hours. And alongside that, you'll also get contact and detailed information for all our speakers. So if you wish, feel free to reach out and follow up this conversation with a direct communication with them, with Kate, with Gareth, with Dan. I'd encourage you to do that if anything on this session was of interest or piqued your interest. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.